Welcome, Farrow.
Thank you all for coming. I hope the sound is clear. If it turns out that somebody can't hear, like in the back, somebody yell out and I'll speak louder. What you're looking at on the screen is a collage of the skyline of Manhattan done in guns and bullets and 3 stars and stripes from a section of the American flag, 3 splats of blood. I did this 48 years ago when I was about 25, and those represent the 3 assassinations of the 2 Kennedys and Martin Luther King. At that time, I wasn't really an artist yet. I was aspiring to become an artist. I had ideas about doing art, but I didn't know how. I don't have a formal education in art. I'm basically a self-taught artist. And it took a long time for me to develop and get to the point of making a commitment. But what was behind the commitment for me was to be a social commentary artist. I found that writing letters to Congress or the president or protesting with crowds of people did not satisfy my sensibilities that I wanted to reach an audience. I wanted people to understand, my point of view or people like-minded point of view. And so I decided to become an artist to do just that and to express myself that way. It was a long journey. It took me a long time. But obviously, I got there. I'm there now. This was the first effort, and I can't even say I was an artist at that time. But I did evolve into a social commentary artist. I'm going to start by showing some of my early work, which is in bronze. And these are figures from what I call my Icarus series, based on humans. The Icarus myth had everything to do with dreaming of the power of flight, and my series addresses what we've done with the power of flight once we've achieved it. So these are some images. I'm going to go very fast through some of these things because I have a lot of stuff to show you and a lot of things to say. This is something I called Icarus Crucified. So you can see that even early in my work, I was working with religion and war images. That's the Enola Gay that dropped the atom bomb on Japan. This is from my African series, which is not really specifically about Africa. It's about indigenous cultures and how it interfaces with technological cultures and how we sell weapons to people who, really don't create them themselves or even understand their potential until there's disaster all around, and we're seeing that all over the world today. I did this series in the 1980s. The Icarus series was in the 1970s. And so I've been doing this for a long time. Arming boy soldiers and such has been a real issue for me. They're still doing it in the Middle East and Africa a lot. But I did this a long time ago. A lot of people think that I did these things recently when they see images online or something. And I've recently been blogged a lot on this series specifically. And it amuses me because I did it 30 years ago. You can look close and see that I was always into detail. I like the loose modeling style, but the important elements are super detailed. This is the first reliquary I made. It's in the lobby, in the gallery, but it doesn't incorporate guns or bullets or anything like that. It was actually created for a show called Artful Urns, and it was a show about artists' urns for people's ashes after they're cremated. And I came up with that just before a trip to Italy. When I went to Italy, a couple of months after that, I made that sculpture, I started looking at reliquaries. I was actually in Italy looking to study carving because I used to carve and I thought I might go back to it, but I just got hooked on reliquaries and started. So these are some of my very early reliquaries. This one incorporates a gun from Verdun, and I call it a piece of the true gun, which is a play on religious history, and there are about millions of pieces of the true cross in people's collections. You could build a cathedral out of as many pieces of the true cross as exist. So I'm playing on religious history as well as military history. This is a close-up showing the bottom. This is a gun that somebody died holding in that battlefield. It's twisted and bent, and it was buried and then dug up. That was a World War I battlefield, for those who don't know about Verdun, a very famous battle where there were about 1 million casualties and nothing gained. At the bottom, at the base, there are some human bones and bullets that were also dug up at Verdun. This is I'm very fond of that piece. This is an early wall piece that I've done, incorporating bones, bullets, hair, again, using the human elements to humanize this mechanical and military, world. This is another one that incorporates bullets from Verdun with a skull fragment and a nicho, which is a religious frame with religious imaging. And I also use a rosary in there to represent more of the religion. This is another similar in the vein. This is from the first body of work that I did. Then I started getting into bigger things. I found a Nazi gas valve at a garage sale, and I incorporated that into this. I made a swastika of pistols and cast it in resin around the pistols. This piece is in the San Jose Museum in California. Here's a close-up of the gas valve. Machine gun bullets, as a Roman arch. I also incorporated different styles. This is very early in the development of this series. And so I used a Roman arch to reference that era, and then Gothic arches. And in between the Gothic arches is a piece of the Berlin Wall. And then I did a prison guard tower, which, because of our involvement with prisons in the United States, I thought a prison guard tower would top that up really well. And then at the very top is a gun sight. That's a piece of the Berlin Wall with some propaganda on it. Let me go back. At the top was a gun sight and from a machine gun or something like that. Anyway, then I moved into some smaller reliquary pieces. This is actually a shot up glove mold, but it's just shot up just to represent, the violence and gun elements. This is another arm reliquary. In Catholicism, there's a lot of arm reliquaries in churches, and I decided to play originally on the Catholic reliquaries, but I soon realized that I needed to be more equal and address all the religions, not just Catholicism. I started with Catholicism because they do such fancy things and such ornate and even beautiful things. And so they're very easy to play on as an artist. And so it's a lot more challenging to address Protestant and Judaism and Islam. But this is where I started. And at the point where I decided to move into more architectural structures, because most of the religions don't do relics. And I call this a reliquary series. So here's a leg bone. This is a femur, upper thigh. There's another sculpture much larger, again with a leg bone. This was my first trigger finger reliquary, and this was in my first body of work. My earlier work, the bones and such are not encased. Later I decided to encase them because when you do encase things, particularly in glass, it just appears more precious. But this was an early effort, and I still like the piece. It's still good. This is another early one that's in this show. Again, I think it's trigger finger number 2. I've done 20 trigger fingers now. Santo Guerrero has many, many trigger fingers. Santo Guerrero is a saint I made up because I don't want to insult anybody who has a real patron saint. I try to be really respectful in my approach to religion. I don't intend to insult anybody's sensibilities. I really like to be fair-minded, and I think I've achieved that. These are all different versions of trigger finger sculptures, and they're all Santo Guerrero. And I would like to explain that Santo Guerrero is not a real saint. I made the guy up, and I did it because I didn't want to use a real saint or use Jesus or Muhammad or any of those names in vain. I would rather just have my own saint. And so I also named him Santo Guerrero because most of the Romance languages, they feminize the word for war, guerra, etc. I wanted to masculinize the word so that it's just a reference to how it's mostly men who start and fight the wars. That's changing, though. We're getting a lot more women involved. Another trigger finger sculpture. So I'm just showing you a variety of them. I'm going to move fairly fast through these because I have a lot more material to show you. This one's very tiny. Some are bigger, some are small, and these are all different versions of trigger finger sculptures. Some very ornate. This one is a little different. I call this one the fingernail of the trigger finger of Santo Guerrero. That is a fingernail in there under glass, and it's on a precious antique velvet, and I think this is a really beautiful sculpture. It's simple, it's small, it's maybe 10 by 10 inches, maybe 11 inches tall, but it really says a lot, and I'm sorry I don't have it in this show. I would have liked it, but we could only include so many pieces. This is the first synagogue I made. When I started expanding from actual reliquaries into architectural structures so that I could incorporate other religions, but I still wanted to keep a sort of reliquary context, so I tried to create structures with some interiors. Well, for example, this is a temple on a temple. A lot of, throughout history, conquering peoples would knock down the previous culture's temples and build their own on top of that. So I used rusty old bullets that I dug up in a field and built a more modern synagogue above it. And I'm incorporating Uzis, which are Israeli weapons, and AK-47 magazines in the front. And then inside, I have a Torah cover. This is an example. This is the Dome of the Rock and the Wailing Wall. This is actually a temple on a temple. And there are so many examples all over the world of that kind of thing where we're dishonoring the people that came before. Just another example of religious intolerance. So here's the front view, and inside the glass, there's a Torah cover with the 10 Commandments embroidered on it. And it's relatively simple, but it looks a lot like a fortress, which was my intent. And so it was the first effort with synagogues. This is a view down to the dome. If you look at it sideways, it looks like there are arches on the dome, but when you look down, it's actually a Star of David. This is the piece under construction. I started to show this. What I do is welded steel sculpture, and then I decorate the surfaces. So you can see all these gun barrels sticking out toward you in the front, and the arches, which haven't been assembled, but the guns have been welded on. And so this is the beginning, how I start constructing these pieces. Here it's a little further developed, and you can see the first row of bullets on the dome. And this is as it develops. So you see the tape on the top. That's how I create my lines, so I can follow those lines when I attach the bullets. A lot of people think I solder every bullet on. I don't. I glue it. I use epoxy, very good epoxies. So it's labor intensive, but not as labor intensive as soldering every bullet. This is another synagogue, which is a takeoff on the La Sinagoga Maggiore in Florence. It's the main synagogue of Florence, Italy. It's a really beautiful building. It's another view. Here's the actual building. And this is how I start. When I started this sculpture, I lay out my guns on the floor, and I put some bullets and things around, and I start imagining what it might look like as a structure. And so I really start very simply, just, and it develops from there. I change it time after time. This is how it looks while it's just started under construction. You might see gears, and there's a brake drum under the dome at the top. I use industrial elements so that I can evoke something about the military-industrial establishment, and I need symbols of industry. And so I'll use any industrial elements, and I particularly like using gears. So this is the same piece under construction. They're very complicated and very labor-intensive. Once I get to the point, I'll sometimes assemble parts, different sections, like the drum of the dome, and the dome is separate, and I would weld that on after. But for me to put the bullets on, gravity is fighting me all the way. And so I have to tilt these things up. They start getting really heavy. And as you can see, I have some clamps on the edge of the table, and I've blocked it up so that I can start gluing, and gravity's not going to pull them off or make it slide. This is yet another synagogue that I've designed more as kind of a medieval look. I think this one was very successful. Again, I've always used Uzis with my synagogues because it's an Israeli gun. This is that same synagogue under construction. And you can see the walls. I haven't cut the window spaces out yet or anything like that. And you can see I've got a brake drum under the dome and all these guns lined up. These are machine gun barrels. This is the synagogue you see in the show. This is probably the most complicated piece I've ever done, one of the most, and I consider it one of my best pieces ever. I'll probably never do anything like this again. It was really difficult. I used a lot of computer drawing and stuff in this one and in one other piece, and I decided after doing these that I'm not going to use that approach any longer because I don't want to spend a year or year and a half on a sculpture because I'm old and I'm not going to live that long, and I want to do a lot, not a little. So I figure. Also, it was expensive and really, really terribly time-consuming to work with the computer stuff. I also needed it because I was doing very delicate details that you'll notice when you look close at this sculpture. And I was using high-tech techniques like water jet cutting, which is a kind of technical thing, but it's basically you can cut steel, really thick steel, very easily with this technique, but it costs like $600 an hour to get somebody to do this. And if I wanted to buy the machine, it would be about $1 million. So that was out of the ballpark. This is that sculpture under construction. I made each panel for each bay for the windows. I would make them all separately and then weld them to the gun barrels that you see. There's a side view. Here's the piece under construction. And that's what it looks like in the beginning. It's really a skeleton. Here you got a good shot of the front view. I'm very proud of this sculpture, and I wish I was younger so I could do more like it, but I am not going there. So I think the construction pieces really show a lot of the detail effort. It's the portico on the sides. Windows, little doorways. The glass reflector for the doorway, those are used in minefields facing not the enemy, but your own army so that they don't step on the mines. It's a warning thing. I was lucky enough to find some, and I incorporated them as doors. Here's a pile of elements that I used in that sculpture, and it's just a shot of, the mess I do. When I'm gluing the shells, like on the roof of this sculpture, I'm using epoxies. What you see is I've scored with some mechanical device so that the glue really sticks to the steel. In the front dome, you see the black epoxy. I like to use black because if there's any space or something in between, it shows as shadow. You see a bucket that's full of several thousand cut-off shells. And these are, I will spend weeks just cutting shells because all the calibers are different lengths, and I have to get them all the same length so that they have the same height. And I believe I cut these down to a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, I can't remember right now. And that takes an enormous amount of time. And this is what it looked like before patina, when the dome was fully glued. Here's another one. This is the second piece that I used these computer and water jet cutting techniques on. This is the main synagogue of Brussels. I had a show in Brussels a couple of years ago, and I thought it might be nice to create something that was from that place. And of course I thought it would sell, but it didn't. So there you have it, we still have it. Anyway, this is a super complicated piece too. Not as complex as the one I just showed you, but the towers on this one are so incredibly detailed that the windows, each level of windows are completely different designs. It's a beautiful building. This is the piece under construction, and you can see, the raw steel. Here, I've already got the sides glued with shot. And this is gluing the bullets on the roof. And there are, I think, if I remember right, 5,000 or 6,000 bullets on this roof. It takes a lot. These, and even to create the color takes a lot of effort. It's a multi-layered patina process, which I will get into a little bit later. This is the front view. This is the piece under construction with the artist in the background. Again, more construction pieces. You might see some of the detail that each level, even though it's not a full shot, each floor has completely different arches and sub-arches and other details. This took so much time, just drove me crazy, but it was fun. This is a menorah. I did a series of menorahs. I have two types. My large menorahs with guns, like you saw out in the gallery. And I call this a fence menorah. I'm trying to reference the barbed wire fences of the concentration camps. So what you see is a large shell surmounted by another shell, and then a whole series, and these are 20 millimeter shells, and these are bullets that would be shot out of airplanes. They're large. The candles are like 3/4 inch diameter. It's sitting on a Star of David and then surrounded by bullets. Here's a close-up. And I do a series of these, but each one is different. I don't do any identically. So here's another example of a fence menorah using some gears, still with the Star of David and that fence motif. There's a detail of the bottom. I particularly like the use of this type of gear at the bottom as a base. It really speaks the industrial side of the military-industrial complex. This is another example of the type that's in the show here, but slightly different. These guns are overlapped instead of welded end to end, and then I have pistols at the bottom, which I didn't use in the one in this show. Yet another example, actually this is the one in the show, with candles lit. I decided at a certain point to do some Judaica. This is a 19th century style dreidel, which is a game that Jewish children play around the Hanukkah holiday. And instead of Hebrew letters that indicate whether you win, lose, or draw, I substituted those Hebrew letters with dollar, pounds, yen, and so on. And I vary those now that China is a big economy, and I always have Israeli shekels as one of the symbols. This is a mezuzah, which is a religious object that Jewish people put on a doorway, an entryway, and it's sort of a protective device. And for me, it really represents the violence that's going on with Israel continuously. And so for me, it represents the whole story, all reduced to one shell. Inside is a prayer that's a traditional scroll on parchment that's hand-lettered in Hebrew. And I buy those online. They're expensive. It's all hand-lettered, it's really tiny. This is another piece of Judaica that's called a spice box. That's part of Jewish weekly rituals after the Sabbath. And it's made out of a World War I artillery shell with a Star of David and some fancy finial. This is the first mausoleum that I created. This is actually a takeoff on Jinnah's tomb. Jinnah was the first leader of Pakistan after the partition of India and Pakistan. And he's buried in a building that's very similar to this. In my research, I just found the building so beautiful, I just had to do a version of it. And of course, Pakistan has been involved and continues to be involved in a lot of conflict, again, with religion involved between Hindu and Muslim. So the guns, and the entire thing is composed of bullets. The doorways are magazines, large capacity magazines. And inside, although I don't have a good shot of the inside, this is it under construction. I made a smaller version of this, but it just didn't have any punch. So I wasn't gonna allow it to be viewed. And so, all my friends said, well, I'll take it, Every artist gets that, If you don't like it, I like it. Well, I would never give it away. What I did is I put it inside this one. And inside that, a little, reference to a coffin. There, you can see part of it. So you can see the layers inside. These are the bullets. They're copper-jacketed bullets, and I'm still in the gluing process. You can see a tweezer and some loose bullets sitting around there. I was still gluing that layer underneath the magazines at that crosser from gun to gun. Then I do a patina with chemicals to turn it white. But you can just about see that smaller version of that inside. There it is. I didn't realize I had that. But it just didn't have any power, So it looked like a good interior. So there's one in front of the other. This is how I do the patinas. Okay, I'm putting the chemicals on. If the chemicals get on the guns, they're going to turn white, and it's really hard to get that stuff off because I use heat, and it really adheres the chemicals to the surface of the metal. So I have to tape off everything. Like it takes 2 or 3 days to tape off a piece like this. And because everything has to be really protected against the chemicals. This is the second mausoleum I did, and this one's in the show. This was a very challenging piece. This is based on a 9th century Samanid mausoleum in Uzbekistan. Again, it's a piece of architecture that I just fell in love with. It's a mud brick architecture. I'm going to find a photo of it so I can incorporate it into my artist talks, but I don't have one now, sorry. Here's a view of the dome, and you can see I've marked off those arches, but when you look straight down, like the Star of David on that synagogue, this is an 8-pointed Islamic star with another one in the middle. And when viewed from the side, they turn into arches. And it's a really interesting element. Here you can see the process of gluing, where some are glued and some not. And you can see the star at the top. That's the interior before I put the roof on. Notice that raw steel look. I really like that. But I'm so caught up in the decoration and creating the total piece that I envision. I really, at some point, want to do some just like that with no decoration. And it's going to take a little bit more courage on my part to not use all the fancy elements to decorate the piece, so that I want to do a little series of really raw pieces. Here's how I start the patterns. I start laying these things out with different bullets and different shells, and I'll do all these patterns, and then I'll take a picture of it with my phone, and then move on and make another one and another one. And sometimes I'll go through 20, 25 different designs, and then I just compare all my photos and decide which one's the best. Sometimes the first design is the best, sometimes the last. So I just go through every idea I can possibly muster. So you can see the bullets and shells on the left are completely different design than the right on the upper and the lower section. And the reason is I can do 2 designs at once and take a picture of it. So this is, like one of those pictures from that series. There's the finished piece. This one you're all familiar with. It's part of the 21C collection, and I'm delighted with that. It looks beautiful in the show. I don't have that one under pictures under construction. I did this sculpture, by the way, in right after the bombing of the towers in 9/11. I was grieving. I had lost a son that year, and I was not really working. I just couldn't muster the spirit to create. But after 9/11, I was invited into a show called Artist's Response to 9/11. And so I forced myself to work, and this was what came out. And I'm very pleased with the results. It references the Dome of the Rock, and it was just my first effort at Islamic art. This one is a takeoff of the National Mosque of Nigeria. It incorporates a lot of shells and bullets, but the main elements are the minarets, which are tank buster missiles. They're inert. They don't explode. They're made of, they have tungsten, and sometimes they have depleted uranium in them and stuff like that. And they're used to shoot from tank to tank. And they don't blow up the tank. They are fired at such a high velocity that they turn the armor plate of the tank into plasma, and they penetrate, and the sparks go all over the interior, and the munitions inside the tank that's fired upon all explode. And I've seen videos of this, and it's really kind of fascinating how these missiles can go 1 mile per second, and they're accurate to 20 miles. Anyway, they're available for just a few $100s each. Here's the mosque itself. It's a huge structure, but in trying to keep my scale and a livable scale, I had to use very small bullets. The shells on the walls are just 22s, which are the smallest shells that are made. And I was trying to keep the size of the piece down. It still came out to almost 30 by 30 inches, the footprint. Here's a view from the top. And here's under construction, and this is how I do it. When I put the bullets on the the wall all the way around. I drill holes and glue a shell into each hole. When I started doing these, I just glued them and they fall off. So everything developed. As this series developed, my techniques developed and got way better. And nowadays, I actually screw almost every bullet into things. I have to tap threads in it, I have to drill it out and countersink. It's amazingly time intensive, but then they never fall off. Okay, bombed mosque. Well, this was a really major project that took over a year with several assistants. It incorporates heavy machine gun barrels for minarets. I cut them down. They were much taller. I just needed it to be in scale. This is how it looked under construction before decorating. You see all that wood behind there? That's what I was going to carve when I came back from Italy. I gave it all away to artists and wood turners. I was seasoning wood for 40 years, and I gave it away because I needed room for my guns and bullets. I was really expanding. Here's the walls before decoration. It's not easy. I have assistants, but like my assistant on this job had a pretty big ego and didn't like to take instruction. And so I asked him to create these walls. I designed them out. I drew every wall, made dimensions for everything, and I said, put a half-inch steel bar between each of those runs on the frame. And he didn't do that. So when I went to apply the bullets, they wouldn't fit and they wouldn't come out the same because that element goes all around the entire structure and between every panel and along the roof. And so I had to throw them all out and start over. He didn't work for me long after that. So here's how I started building these. Now, if you notice when you look close at that mosque, there are alleyways on both ends that go in two directions, and they're decorated inside both sides of the alley as well as outside the wall. So this was very complicated for me. I had to create the walls and as separate units and then brace them and then get everything done for the interiors that could be visible from the outside before I can do the outside. It really made it complicated. So here's an example where you see the outside wall is not decorated, the inside is, but the back of the outside wall is decorated. So, and I've done different designs on the inside and outside. So if in the future anybody analyzes the designs of the arrangement of all these bullets, there are a lot of variation, even though it looks kind of uniform. So in the creation of this, we had some issues in getting the look of that bombed thing. And I'm going to show you a video, or two videos, of creating that. In the background, you can see a small version of this that's all cut up. I didn't want to ruin, well, actually, when I was about to create the destructed part, everybody I know who had come visited my studio said, don't do it, it's beautiful, leave it just the way it is. And I said, no, this is going to be destroyed. It has to be. It's how I envisioned it from the time I started it. Everyone said, no, don't do it. You're going to ruin the piece, so on. So I didn't want to ruin it, so I made another section exactly the same as a practice piece to see what would happen if I took my torch, which is like 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and start melting the bullets and the steel underneath and seeing what would happen and would I have the control that I hoped I had. And so I did, but I'm going to show you a video of the thing in motion. This is the inside of the dome, by the way, which is impossible to see from the outside. I still decorated it because, you know, I like the beauty of it. I enjoy making the whole thing complete. And I wasn't sure how much was going to be visible after. And once it's welded on, I couldn't get back in. So I decorated it completely. There's the look. And here's the video of the practice piece. We're going to hear some shots. Watch the body language. I did get shot. I got hit in the neck. It went through my turtleneck and burned my skin and actually branded my neck with the back of a bullet shell. In the beginning, I could see the letters in a circle. But I kept working. Now here's the destruction of the actual piece. By the way, everybody wanted a piece or that trial piece. Everybody said, I'll take it. What are you going to do? You're not going to throw that away. I cut it up and I put it inside the mosque after I had a hole big enough to get stuff in. So you can see everything's going on fire. The glues are burning. Stuff is melting. So my assistant is using a fire extinguisher and wet towels to cool it. You'll see. I did have to protect my eyes on that one. Some things went flying also. I mean, I had a high school class watching me do this. And it was really weird. I didn't expect to have an audience, but a good friend of mine who's an artist and teaches, he said, can I come by and bring my class? I said, sure, let's do it. So one of the bullets flew off and burned a hole in somebody's pants. And it was kind of interesting. But the reason I cut up the practice piece and put it inside is that they had all these decorated walls and pieces of the dome and stuff. And I wanted the interior, if somebody looks inside, you guys could take the flashlight on your iPhone and look inside and you'll see the walls. And it looks like the walls collapsed after it's been bombed or something. And so it adds to the total effect. John Melvin was my assistant. I was the actor. So there it is finished. And the interesting thing is I have a friend who's a retired fireman and his job was investigating fire scenes. And he came over to look at it. And when he saw the finished look, he said, man, you got it so right. That is exactly how it would look if it had been bombed. So I felt pretty good about that. I mean, I glued every shell and piece wherever it fell. I didn't manipulate it. Wherever it landed, I glued it. And then I glued all the ashes and put dust all over it, and it really was effective. Here's a shot down one of the alleys. Front view. This is the front under construction where I used like an epoxy clay, something for the artists here that's called Magic Sculpt. And I inserted the shells into it. Another view. If you use your flashlights, you can see these things. When the sculpture's, lit in a gallery situation, the interior things don't show that well, so your flashlights would help. Here's a shot of my table when I'm gluing those panels for the mosque. You could see on the right side tweezers and tools and things, but every one of those buckets has a different bullet or shell or a different color or different whatever that I have to choose from to create these arrangements and designs of each of these panels. So I had dozens of choices for everything. And trust me, each one of those is prepared. They have to be cut, they have to be colored. I do the coloring of the shells before I glue them. It would be too hard to control it otherwise. Here's the personal vibrator of Santo Guerrero. Oops. This is a fun piece I did. It's just a mirror. I made it for a fundraiser for an organization that brings art to the inner city neighborhoods. It's a mirror with 4 revolvers and a bunch of bullets. It's a simple piece. This is a much larger one, and it's called the trigger finger and 2 ribs of Santo Guerrero. This is an important piece because I worked out this Gothic door using the receiver of a BB gun as the doors. You can see the trigger guards and all that. And then just creating this sense of Gothic, entryway. And this enabled me to design all the different entryways to the cathedral that I ultimately built after this. So this one really was an important transition piece for me. It's a beautiful piece. And it's probably maybe 5 feet tall. I don't know. It's pretty big. It's kind of like a church reduced, in footprint, but with all the elements. Here's the cathedral that I was mentioning. This thing is big. The de Young Museum in San Francisco owns this. And unfortunately, they wouldn't loan it to us here. And I'm not too happy about that because I think this would have looked great here. It's about 6 feet long, 5 feet tall, and about 4 feet wide. Here's a piece at the Catherine Clark Gallery at the opening when I introduced it. It was a major hit. So here it is as a skeleton before I did practically anything. Those are all machine gun barrels. These are different views of it under construction in various phases. I have hundreds and hundreds of photos, but I can't bore the audience with all of that. So I'm trying to keep it short. So these are different views of the different levels of development as things are going. The elements in the tower on the right-hand side are all Nazi machine gun barrels of the type that I used in the menorah that's in the show. These things are really hard to get now. It's like, you can almost not get them. They become collector objects. Here's the gluing process. Man, is this tedious. Even getting the shot. This is while I'm gluing the shot. So here I have to turn the whole thing on its side. So you can see the guns are actually flying buttresses, turned over to the side. So this is part of the process of gluing. I need to work with gravity rather than fight it. So I have to keep repositioning the sculpture. Here it is tilted up. And this thing weighs hundreds of pounds. And different ways to prop it up and whatever. But it's definitely just the manipulation of it to work with it is something that really takes a lot of thought. There's a side view. Okay, here's the bullets that I use on the lower roof. And this is the process that I do for the patinas, like on the roof of the Protestant church in the show. First I turn, these are copper sheathed lead bullets. First I turn them black with one chemical, then I rinse them and dry them. Then I put them in a very strong acid that turns them this very ugly green. It's very acidic and yellowy, and it's not very attractive, but it's just part of the way. Then I have to stand each of these up, and this is, you can see they're all sitting on newspaper. I have to re-wet them and mist them 3, 4, 5 times, because every time I mist them, because I don't rinse the acid off, it reactivates the acids and it changes the color every time it dries. And so after several mistings, the bullets turn a color I really like. And then I soak them in flat lacquer. And then I dry them in like a big coffee can with an air gun, so they bounce all over the place while they're drying, and they nick each other and ding each other, and then I get that nice antique look. So if you look close at the bullets, that's the process I go through. There's about 5,000 or 6,000 on that church roof. There were more in this piece. So there you can see some of those bullets behind the flying buttresses. Some more views. Overall front. I call this actually the spine and tooth of Sant'Aguero. And there's a whole human spine inside on an antique textile. And then over one of the doors, there's a tooth. This is one of the doors under construction. And you can see I try so many different arrangements of shells. This is before decoration. So here's a gun sight in the front as a finial. And I had this little gold-plated Christ figure that I wanted to mount on the gun sight like a crucifix. The gun sight was made of such hard metal, I couldn't drill into it. I got all these carbide drill bits and stuff like that. I broke dozens of them, and I was like totally frustrated. The only way to make holes in this to receive pins to hold the Christ figure on was to heat it up yellow hot and take pins and hammer the holes into it. So here you see it heated up. It's a two-man operation because someone holds the torch and someone else has to do that. Then here's the patina process for darkening the metal. I bead blast it, take all the color off, and have raw metal. And I soak it in a chemical to turn it black, like I mentioned before. I do that on all the steel. After that, I lacquer it. And so here it is finished, and there it is mounted. And it took so much time and so much effort. It's crazy, but I do take that kind of time for the details. Here's a shot of some of my crucifix collection. So I probably have 20 crucifixes on that cathedral. And so I'm always looking for what fits just right, what has the right flavor, just so that it has the right feel. So you can see the tooth above the door. There's another shot. Each of the doors is completely different than the other. No, none are the same. I'm a little crazy that way. I like to challenge myself to make things different. I could easily have done the same pattern for all three, but I decided they would all be completely different than each other. As a back view, a lot of people think this might be the Chartres Cathedral or Notre Dame. I borrowed elements from a lot of different cathedrals. I'm particularly fond of the French and German Gothic cathedrals. I think they're superior to some of the other Gothic styles. And so I referenced a lot of different cathedrals, but taking elements from one or another. But it's a cathedral of my own creation. And you can see I used a lot of guns in that piece. All the flying buttresses all around are the same pistol, which are the same pistols that are in the menorah that's in the show. Now we get to the country church. I love this sculpture. I might even keep it. I don't own any of my own reliquaries, and this is one I'm considering keeping. I am crazy about these little churches you see everywhere in America, especially country churches. They have a neo-Gothic style over the doors and windows. And these are all, the siding and all is supposed to look a little bit like clapboard, and it's really 30 caliber rifle bullets, military. Inside, I have a Bible open to Revelation with a facsimile of Albrecht Dürer's Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse to give it a little bit extra apocalyptic element. Not that it really needs it, but I think it helps. It's hard to see it, but if you use your phone flashlight, you might get a better view of it. Here's me working on the patina. Again, everything's taped off so that I don't get the chemicals on the guns. The roof is made out of flattened bullets. Now this took some real experimenting. You can't just flatten a bullet. The back end of the shell is very thick. The front end is very thin, and it won't collapse the way you want. The bullet itself that I'm using is lead with a copper jacket. So if the pressure is too high, it just looked like a mushroom with the lead spewing out from the shell. It would get flat, but it just wouldn't look like a flat bullet. So I had to experiment with different pressures, and I used a hydraulic press, hand-operated, and I finally figured out that 20,000 psi, that's pounds per square inch, pressure was the exact correct pressure to flatten the bullet and not distort it. So one bullet at a time took a week. I flattened all the bullets. Here's the gluing process again, turning it so that gravity is working with me rather than against me. Here I'm doing the chimney, which is, supposed to look like a stone, those river stone type chimneys. So I used every kind of lead bullet I can find and mixed them all up like random stones. Again, working with gravity, I have to keep turning things so that I can keep gravity on my side. So the bullets that I described, the patina process, they're exactly the same for doing these. This was my first wall piece. It's outside on a wall on the way to the elevators and the bathrooms. Great bathrooms. I call it Sketch of Trinity Church because for me it was the first effort on this wall, attempt for a wall sculpture relief. And it's on Wall Street in New York, and so I wanted that money reference, and that's one of the reasons I chose this. Also, I was having a show in New York, and again, I like to do something of the place if I have the time and the materials that I can pull that off. So this was one of those. I'm particularly pleased with this. And also, I think it looks fantastic in the show. I mean, it's isolated, and it just has such a presence. It really pleases me. This is the burned church in the show. And I'm incorporating 3 rifles that were dug up at Verdun. I kept these things for probably 15 years before I actually used them because, again, like the Nazi gas valve, I don't want to waste a good element. I'll never find another one like it. And so I waited many, many years till I finally found the precise fit to use these things. I find them to be precious objects, and they're actual war relics because they were dug up in a battlefield. This gun was in the Oakland fire, which was a major fire in the Bay Area where we live. Inside, I have all kinds of rusty stuff that I've collected over the years. I do restoration of sculpture as a side business to make money when I need extra money. And so a lot of people have leftovers. And I had some 3,000-year-old iron swords that were so disintegrated that the owners said, just throw them away. So of course I saved them. And some of those are actually in there. So some of those rusty things inside are actually 3,000 years old. This is a beautiful piece that's sold in Europe when I had a show there. It's a small Gothic church. It has a skull, a human skull inside, that pretty much fills up the whole lower floor. It's like five levels. Really fun piece. The only way you can see the face of the skull is through this little reducing lens in the front door. I do stuff like that. I like to play with optics. Here's another wall piece. I call it Southwest Church. Sort of kind of like the Alamo, that sort of thing, with a stucco look that's done with shot and a white patina, and incorporating appropriate era, mid-19th century guns. This is a gold-plated version of the personal vibrator of Sant'Aguero in a casket. So it's a casket reliquary. Interesting piece with revolver hammers as feet, and then the whole thing is decorated. This is another casket reliquary, much larger, that has a whole foot in it. This one's in the show. I think this is one of my strongest pieces. I had this vision for a long time of using a skull drowning in bullets, and I finally got to the point where I figured out how to make it work. Instead of incorporating it in a church or a major structure, I decided to go with glass and just frame it with artillery shells. But it incorporates on the roof high-capacity magazines, reducing lenses that, if you look in, will show the skull very differently than you see it when you look through the windows. It has lots of bullets and other elements, and gun frames for the feet. This is a tiny little reliquary that I call the jawbone of Sant'Aguero. And it's made out of gun parts and bullets, but it's a really sweet, small piece. This is a gorgeous little piece, wall piece. It's just a Gothic door, but it has two pistols. I don't have a lot of views of this. I've really reduced this so that I didn't have too much information for all you folks. I have too many images, so I took a lot out before I did this to keep it shorter. There are two pistols on the sides of the doors and bullets decorating everything. Sometimes I just like to do something pretty. That was really pretty. And this one actually is pretty, too. I generally don't go for pretty, but every once in a while it takes over. Now we're coming to the end. This is, I'm starting a series of doors, and this is the beginning of an Islamic door. This is the layout where I take a scribe to the sheets of steel. So I can do the geometry. It's very geometric, and that's how I arrange the bullets in all these geometric patterns. But I had to lay it out and then glue the bullets along all the lines that I created before I filled it in with a filler to keep it from ever moving. In the background are full 9mm bullets with a blue patina in the upper area. Then I vandalized it. This is a big piece. It's about 3 feet tall, maybe a little bit more than that. And it's something I didn't think would ever sell. On the side, you see there, those are some of my printouts of things I found on the internet on actual vandalized mosque doors. And I never used an airbrush before this, so I was practicing to try to get the right scale to vandalize these doors. And that's the finished piece. I'm really pleased with this, and this is the beginning of a direction I'm exploring now, where the doors being portals are so important. When I do these structures, I still use fancy doors, but I only have 1.5 to 3 inches on those doors, and I can't elaborate. The door is the portal, it's the entry, it's the exit, it's a really important element. It also establishes the scale, the human scale of the sculpture, because if you imagine the door, you imagine how big a person might be in relation to that, and then you get a sense of scale for the whole thing. I'm moving into a larger scale where I can really elaborate on these doors. And I think this is going to be an important part of the series, the continuing series in this vein. And I did a synagogue door. This is the beginning of how I'm constructing it. You can see I'm trying out different elements. These are different arrangements of bullets inside circles of steel to see what might work, what might not work for this total design. This one's about 4 feet tall. And this is the final piece, which I vandalized with a swastika. And it's an absolutely beautiful thing. And I was really aiming for the most beauty I can pull out so that it would really contrast with the ugliness of what vandalism is. And I actually never in a million years thought these things would sell. And they did. I had a show in New York last year, and they sold right away. And I was actually amazed and surprised, because I thought I was going to get a lot of flack for these, and I didn't get any. And so I don't know why. That's it. I don't know what this is. So we're done. Thank you. Thank you.